So my watch says 12:30. Shall we start? My name is Christian Kopff. I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder in the honors program, where I teach traditions from the ancient Mediterranean that are still of possible interest, including Greek literature, Greek science, and introduction to the Bible. I agreed to talk about Tolkien as a project of classical Christian education. As I ended up writing the piece, it turned into an essay which I've retitled Tolkien, Classical, Christian, and German. But I don't think that makes it less appropriate for a Lutheran audience. Perhaps more, we'll see. I like to talk about figures who've been important in the modern period who had classical Christian educations. That gives me a lot to talk about because most of them did. In literature, from Dante to T.S. Eliot, in science, from Copernicus to Werner Heisenberg, you can go down the list, in art. So, today I'm talking about the man who wrote the most popular novel of the 20th century and was responsible for 3 of the most popular films of the 21st century. Where we have our CCLE 114. There may be someone else talking to another audience about this. I'm reminded of the story of the American tourists who were visiting Rome for the first time, and they asked the owner of the pensione where they were staying where they should go, and he said, well, Rome has so many wonderful sights, but you should definitely not miss the Roman Forum. And they went away and came back for lunch. They were on a meal plan with the pensione, and they were sort of quiet and even grim-mouthed. And finally, the owner, a typical Italian who likes to be liked, went up to them and said, well, what's wrong? Did I say something wrong? What happened? And finally, the American man burst out, we never knew you Italians were such chauvinists. We come here in good faith and ask you a question about a place to visit, and you send us to some place we bombed in World War II. Well, sometimes it's hard to remember that there are ruins that were not created in the 20th century, although the 20th century certainly did its fair share. Today, few tourists visit the ancient shrine of the Doctus Poeta, as the Romans called him, the poet who was also a scholar. Unlike the Roman Forum, where he once roamed, the scholar-poet really is a victim of the 20th century, as it drew to its close and a new century and a new millennium began. Virgil, Dante, Tasso, and Milton seem to have no real successors. Of course, universities have positions for a few poets and token creative writers, but in general, today's universities cannot comprehend, let alone foster, the humane ideal of the Doctus Poeta. Scholar poets did survive as an endangered species in the last century, but like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, they rarely held university appointments. When they did, their scholarship was often marginalized. A.E. Housman's a good example. There are quite a few biographies of Housman. They get good reviews and tend to concentrate on the few months when he wrote many of his poems, which are usually discussed in relation to his rather pitiable love life. Hausman's many volumes of scholarship, which rescued English classical studies from provincialism and mediocrity, are viewed as a parergon, something he did to fill in the years between poems. The American literary critic Edmund Wilson set the tone. Wilson sneered at Hausman's scholarship because Hausman edited the Silver Latin poets, Juvenal and Lucan, and never published his edition of the Augustan love poet, Propertius. In Wilson's view, Hausman neglected love for rhetoric. Wilson could not understand the centrality of Juvenal, the satirist, for modern culture, and the importance of Lucan and Roman libertas for the ideal of freedom in the age of Milton and the American founders. Edmund Wilson also had his innings at J.R.R. Tolkien, another professorial scholar-poet of the 20th century. Wilson, the literary critic, read in the publisher's press release that Tolkien, professor of English and former professor of Anglo-Saxon, had located the origin of the Lord of the Rings in what Tolkien called his secret vice of inventing languages, which then needed mythology and history in which to grow and develop. Tolkien told the editors, quotes, "The stories were made up rather to provide a world for the languages than vice versa," end quotes. Edmund Wilson was aghast. He wrote, quotes, "An overgrown fairy story, a philological curiosity. That is then what the Lord of the Rings really is. These long-winded volumes of what looks to this reviewer like balderdash appeals to certain people, especially perhaps in Britain, with a lifelong appetite for juvenile trash," end quotes. The enthusiasm of two generations of readers all over the world suggests that Edmund Wilson missed the boat about Lord of the Rings. Turned out there was more of an audience for it than Wilson understood. I'd like to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien from the perspective of his classical Christian education. His family was poor. His father passed away when he was 4 years old in 1896, and his mother died of diabetes in 1904. His father, however, was an alumnus of a respected classical Christian public school, King Edward VI School in Birmingham, where Tolkien was educated for most of the time on a fellowship. Although he passed the entrance examination only on the second try, and for financial reasons attended an inferior Catholic school for a year, once he was accepted at King Edward's, Tolkien proved himself an excellent student who mastered Latin, Greek, French, and German in regular classes and studied Old and Middle English on his own. As Humphrey Carpenter wrote in his life of Tolkien, let me mention, Carpenter's life is wonderful because it talks about his education. Many lives skip people's educations because that's not important. Humphrey Carpenter wrote in his life of Tolkien, quotes, "Ronald Tolkien had an aptitude for languages." His mother had seen that. And King Edward's provided the ideal environment in which this aptitude could flourish. The study of Latin and Greek was the backbone of the curriculum, end quotes. In fact, the classical languages were not just studied in class. They permeated the life of the school. Carpenter relates, quotes, "The summer term of 1911 was his last to King Edward's. It ended, as usual, with the performance of a Greek play with the choruses set to music hall tunes. This time the choice was Aristophanes' The Peace, in which Tolkien took the part of Hermes. Afterwards, another King Edward's custom, the national anthem was sung in Greek." Years later, Tolkien told reporters, quotes, "I have, for instance, a particular love for the Latin language," end quotes. He wrote his son Michael that as a Roman Catholic attending a Protestant school, he moved back and forth between the two pronunciations of Latin. Quotes, "I had the advantage of a then first-rate school and that of a good Catholic home. Observance of religion was strict. Hilary, his brother, and I were supposed to, and usually did, serve Mass before getting on our bikes to go to school in New Street. So I grew up in a two-front state, symbolized by the oratory and Italian pronunciation of Latin in church and the strictly philological pronunciation at that time introduced into our Cambridge-dominated school," end quotes. He wrote his family friend, Father Robert Murray, quotes, "I was brought up in the classics and first discovered the sensation of literary pleasure in Homer," end quotes. By the way, Greek and Latin did not satisfy young Tolkien. Humphrey Carpenter tells us, quotes, "There was a custom at King Edward's of holding a debate entirely in Latin. They did have a debate society, but it was in Latin. But that was almost too easy for Tolkien. One debate, when taking the role of a Greek ambassador to the Senate, he spoke entirely in ancient Greek. On another occasion, he astonished his schoolfellows when in the character of a barbarian envoy, he broke into fluent Gothic. On a third occasion, he spoke in Anglo-Saxon. See, in our schools, he would have been beaten up after lunch almost every day, right? It's another advantage of going to this school. His classical Christian education prepared Tolkien for and encouraged him in successful careers as a best-selling author and an important philologist, a scholar of language. He approached his creative work as a philologist. He developed languages for each group in Lord of the Rings and told the press, quotes, "I should have preferred to write in Elfish," end quotes. This was something else that drove Edmund Wilson crazy, who clearly had no sense of humor at all. Took these comments as completely serious statements. The talk of ancient wars and heroes, of the lovers, Luthien and Beren, are not ad hoc references made up on the spot for literary effect. They are echoes of detailed stories, chronologies, and genealogies developed by Tolkien over decades. In fact, Tolkien wanted the Silmarillion published first as a necessary propedeutic for understanding Lord of the Rings. His development of a detailed history, preceding and underlying Lord of the Rings, gives to the story the effective depth that Tolkien found in his favorite epics, Virgil's Aeneid and the Old English Beowulf. In a footnote to his influential essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, Tolkien wrote, quotes, "The real resemblance of the Aeneid and Beowulf lies in the constant presence of a sense of many-storied antiquity," end quotes. Tolkien considered this his forte as an author, as he wrote his son, Christopher, in 1945, quotes, "There are quite different emotions. One that moves me supremely and I find small difficulty in evoking, the heart-racking sense of the vanished past, best expressed in Gandalf's words about the Palantir. And the other, the more ordinary emotions, triumph, pathos, tragedy of the characters, that I'm learning to do as I get to know my people, but it is not really so near my heart," end quotes. He goes on to talk of, quotes, "a sudden sense of endless, untold stories, mountains seen far away, never to be climbed, distant trees like niggles, never to be approached," end quotes. The ability to evoke this emotion is one Beowulf and the Aeneid share with the Lord of the Rings. Much of the mythological background of the Aeneid is known to readers of Homer, and ancient readers knew even more, which is now lost or survives only in fragments. A great deal of background material survives for Lord of the Rings. Behind its hints of ages past and great races almost vanished from memory lie detailed histories, composed, of course, by Tolkien himself. Christopher Tolkien has edited most of his father's unpublished manuscripts containing these stories. He began with the Silmarillion, 1977, before editing earlier versions of the stories in 12 volumes as the History of Middle-earth, 1983 to 1996, beginning with the Book of Lost Tales, Part 1 and Part 2. The characters and themes of the Lost Tales are closely related to the Silmarillion, but there are significant differences. Christopher Tolkien summarizes some of them. Quotes, "Beren is an elf, not a man in the earlier stories. His captor, the ultimate precursor of Sauron in that role, is a monstrous cat inhabited by a fiend. The dwarves are an evil people, and the historical relations of Quenya and Sindarin, the elfish tongues, were quite differently conceived," end quotes. With Beowulf, too much is lost for a secure reconstruction of its mythological or historical backdrop. But this situation did not discourage Tolkien from investigating the surviving sources. For instance, in Finn and Hengist, the fragment and the episode, edited by Alan Bliss in 1983, Tolkien takes a brief and fragmentary tale sung by a bard in Beowulf and a fragment of the same story that survives on a single manuscript page and tries to reconstruct the history that lies behind the two sources. Not surprisingly, in Tolkien's interpretation, the story tells of the fall of a great prehistoric people and the birth of a new age. The Jutes fall with the death of their young prince, but Hengist arises from the tragedy to lead the German people into Celtic Britain and found Anglo-Saxon England. We're impressed by the scope and sympathy of Tolkien's scholarly imagination, while acknowledging that too little of the original text survives for certainty, and even admitting that some aspects of the argument are forced or fanciful. In Anglo-Saxon scholarship, Tolkien was as important a figure as A. E. Housman was in Latin studies. His most influential work was the essay Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, which Tolkien delivered as a lecture to the British Academy in 1936. In it, Tolkien sets out to explain how the Christian author of Beowulf, he was sure he was a Christian, could create a fictional world that preserved pagan German stories and attitudes while being true to the drama of Christian morality, but without mentioning Christ. Few in his audience in 1936, except for friends like C.S. Lewis, could have known that the goal Tolkien ascribed to the Beowulf poet was the mission he had set himself. Of Beowulf, The Monsters and the Critics, it's hardly too much to say that this one essay changed forever the study of a major work in the canon of English literature. Indeed, it rescued Beowulf from the hands of scholars who were treating it as a philological curiosity, in Wilson's words, and established the poem for the first time as a work of literature. To appreciate the effect of Tolkien's lecture, it's useful to work slowly through Beowulf in the original Old English, or Anglo-Saxon, preferably in Friedrich Kleber's great edition of 1928, slightly revised in 1936, which is one of the greatest works of scholarship to emerge from the American university system. In 2008, 80 years after its first edition, a team of scholars revised it as Kleber's Beowulf and the Battle at Finnsburg. Few scholarly works in any field remain relevant that long. Notwithstanding all of Kleber's indispensable apparatus for understanding Beowulf's roots in etymology and comparative folklore, he discusses the poem's narrative structure only once, in a famous paragraph devoted to the poem's, quotes, lack of steady advance, end quotes. The Icelandic sagas killed off their monsters much more efficiently than the Anglo-Saxon poet. When A. E. Housman's old friend and colleague R.W. Chambers published his book, Beowulf, An Introduction to the Study of the Poem, 1921, he concentrated on historical, not literary topics. Tolkien was justified in noting in 1936, quotes, Beowulf has been used as a query for fact and fancy far more assiduously than has been studied as a work of art. The Monsters and the Critics redressed the balance, touching on issues from the putative influence of Latin epic through its vision of the German heroic ideal. To the mind, at once Christian and elegiac, that created Beowulf. To call Beowulf studies since 1936 a series of footnotes to Tolkien would be unjust. Yet how often even the most original work ends up responding to or reflecting Tolkien's apodictic insights. For instance, Beowulf, the Poem and Its Traditions by Berkeley's John D. Niles is thorough, thought-provoking, and up-to-date. Despite its originality and critical insight, however, Niles' book serves to confirm Tolkien's main thesis, or modify it slightly. In the wake of a generation that made St. Augustine more central for understanding the poem than the German heroic ideal, Niles returns to Tolkien's belief that the Beowulf is a poem composed by a Christian, but not a Christian poem. I believe this is also true of Lord of the Rings. One of the elements that's made Tolkien's lecture on the monsters and the critics still vital is his portrait of the Beowulf poet and his goals. We, in fact, know little or nothing about the poet, but Tolkien did know a creative figure with this character and goals himself. Tolkien's description of the Beowulf poet may or may not be accurate, but it is spot on as a description of Tolkien. 1. Tolkien writes of the Beowulf poet. 1. The author is a Christian. At several points he mentions the Bible explicitly, but always as narrator. The characters never refer to the Bible. 2. He wrote to preserve the tales, the poetic technique, and above all, what Tolkien called, quotes, the heroic temper of ancient England and Scandinavia, end quotes. 3. He was a scholar poet. Tolkien wrote, quotes, he was in fact like Virgil, learned enough in the vernacular department to have an historical perspective. He knew much about the old days, but one thing he knew clearly, those days were heathen, noble, and hopeless, end quotes. Let me read his summary. Quotes, in Beowulf we have then an historical poem about the pagan past, or an attempt at one. Literal historical fidelity founded on modern research was, of course, not attempted. It is a poem by a learned man writing of old times, who, looking back on the heroism and sorrow, feels in them something permanent and something symbolical. Secondly, to his task the poet brought considerable learning in native lays and traditions. Only by learning and training could such things be acquired. Beowulf is his attempt to depict ancient pre-Christian days, intending to emphasize their nobility and the desire of the good for truth, end quotes. Beowulf is like the Aeneid, but Tolkien does not posit direct influence. He wrote, quotes, the real likeness is deeper and due to certain qualities in the authors, independent of the question whether the Anglo-Saxon had read Virgil or not, end quotes. And he goes on to write, quotes, in fact, the real resemblance of the Aeneid and Beowulf lies in the constant presence of a sense of many-storied antiquity, together with its natural accompaniment, stern and noble melancholy. In this they are really alike, and differ altogether from Homer's flatter, if more glittering, surface, end quotes. Both poets were docti poetae, scholar poets. Tolkien wrote, quotes, to a similar antiquarian temper and a similar use of the vernacular learning is probably due the similar effect of antiquity and melancholy in the Aeneid, end quotes. Tolkien's description of Virgil and the Beowulf poet are also self-portraits. He was a scholar poet and Christian, whose most achieved work attempted to create, or he preferred the term subcreate, a pre-Christian past marked with nobility and tragedy. Its hero is, in his own words, quotes, man alien in a hostile world, engaged in a struggle which he cannot win while the world lasts. The poet of Beowulf saw clearly the wages of heroism is death, end quotes. And he goes on to say, quotes, its maker was telling of things already old and weighted with regret, and he expended his art in making keen that touch upon the heart which sorrows have that are both poignant and remote, end quotes. Or as his contemporary William Butler Yeats wrote, man is in love, and love's what vanishes. For this, the constant presence of a sense of many-storied antiquity is essential. And Tolkien explains, quotes, Beowulf was not designed to tell the story of Hygelac fall, or for that matter to give the biography of Beowulf, still less to write the history of the Geatish kingdom and its downfall. But it used knowledge of these things for its own purpose, to give that sense of perspective, of antiquity with a greater and yet darker antiquity behind, end quotes. Tolkien put the same sense of perspective into Lord of the Rings, with its glimpses of a distant past and of still more distant ones. Scholars have counted the references to the distant past in Lord of the Rings. Peter Kreeft writes in his book, Philosophy of Tolkien, quotes, there are more than 500 references in Lord of the Rings to the past ages of Middle-earth. Clyde Kilby counts 600 in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit together. That's in Kilby's book, Tolkien and the Silmarillion. We may actually question the wisdom of publishing volume after volume of the tales Tolkien wrote to provide a consistent background to Lord of the Rings. The hints of the distant past are essential to the tone of Lord of the Rings. Publishing the excruciating details distracts us from the noble tragedy of this moving and powerful tale of ages before our ages and our religion. In his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien defended the aesthetic and Christian rightness of what he called eucatastrophic closure, the happy ending. This insight and a few comments he made over the years have convinced some critics that Lord of the Rings is a Christian book. Joseph Pearce, in his introduction to Brad Berzer's book on Tolkien, finds it, quotes, not merely erroneous, but patently perverse to see Tolkien's epic as anything other than a specifically Christian myth. Quotes, and then he adds, quotes, the myth behind Tolkien was, of course, Catholic Christianity, the true myth, end quotes. He cites Tolkien's letter to a Catholic priest, Father Robert Murray, who wrote Tolkien with a Catholic interpretation of Lord of the Rings soon after it appeared. Tolkien responded politely, quotes, I think I know exactly what you mean by the order of grace, and of course by your reference to Our Lady, upon whom all my own small perception of beauty, both in majesty and simplicity, is founded. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. At this point, Pearce stops quoting the letter. But actually, Tolkien goes on to write, The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously so in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world, for the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism, end quotes. But Father Murray and Joseph Pearce don't believe that Tolkien eliminated practically all references to religion from Lord of the Rings. For them, the elf queen Galadriel is the Virgin Mary. The waybread, the lembas, she gives the fellowship after setting out from Lothlorien is, according to Pearce, quotes, a clear allusion to the Eucharist, end quotes. You'll remember the passage from the Bible where the Virgin Mary gives followers of Jesus the Eucharist. I have a Protestant Bible, so it doesn't include it, but there must be there somewhere, right? Pearce finds it significant that the fellowship leaves Rivendell on December 25th, but quotes, the key that unlocks the Christianity of Lord of the Rings is the fact that the ring is destroyed on the Feast of the Annunciation, March the 25th, which is also, according to tradition, the date of the crucifixion. This analogically connects the destruction of the ring with the destruction of sin, and therefore the synonymous connection between the ring itself and sin itself, end quotes. For Murray and Pearce, so far from omitting or cutting out references to religion, Tolkien inserted specific references not just to Christian, but to Catholic cults and practices. Pearce also quotes a letter of 25 October 1958 to Deborah Webster, who inquired about details of Tolkien's life. Tolkien objected to, quotes, the contemporary trend in criticism with its excessive interest in the details of the lives of authors and critics, You'll remember Lewis had the same objection to the personal heresy. Tolkien goes on, quotes, "They only distract attention from the author's work." He admits that, quotes, "Of course there's a scale of significance in facts of this sort. Most of them, especially juicy details about bad behavior, are a distraction." He wrote, Deborah Webster quotes, "Then there are more significant facts which have some relation to an author's work, like his own love of language and taste in languages." He then went on to write, quotes, "And there are a few basic facts which, however dryly expressed, are really significant. For instance, I was born in 1892 and lived for my early years in the Shire in a pre-mechanical age." He didn't invent the Shire. He remembered it. Continue my quoting. Quotes, "Of more importance, I'm a Christian, which can be deduced from my stories, and in fact a Roman Catholic. The latter fact, perhaps, cannot be deduced." End quotes. This statement seems to me to mean that there are no explicit references in his writings to indicate his Roman Catholicism. In the letter to Father Murray, Tolkien says he eliminated references that would allow a reader to deduce that he's a Roman Catholic. He then mentions that some critics have seen, as we've already mentioned, quotes in the invocations of Elbereth and the character of Galadriel, references to the Virgin, and in the Lembas a reference to the Eucharist. And he comments, quotes, "That is, far greater things may color the mind in dealing with the lesser things of a fairy story." End quotes. Tolkien acknowledges an author's deepest concerns may influence, he says, color his creative work, even when he omits or eliminates explicit references to them, as he says that he did. In a letter probably written in 1951 to Martin Waldman of Collins Publishing House, Tolkien criticizes what he calls the powerful myth of King Arthur. Quotes, "For one thing, its fairy is too lavish and fantastical, incoherent and repetitive. For another and more important thing, it is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. For reasons I will not elaborate, that seems to me fatal. Myth and fairy story must, as all art, reflect and contain in solution elements of moral and religious truth and error, but not explicitly, not in the known form of the primary real world." End quotes. In 1965, he wrote to W.H. Auden, quotes, "I don't feel under any obligation to make my stories fit with formalized Christian theology, though I actually intended it to be consonant with Christian thought and belief." End quotes. Tolkien received a classical Christian education, where he learned to read Homer in Greek, Virgil in Latin, Beowulf in Old English. He also learned to experience pagan myths as true because they come from the same common source as the true myth. As C.S. Lewis says of the Tao, or the natural law, in Abolition of Man. You remember Lewis's comment near the end. Quotes, "It's at least arguable that every civilization we find has been derived from another civilization, and in the last resort, from a single center, carried like an infectious disease, or the apostolical succession." End quotes. From a classical Christian education, Tolkien learned to treasure beauty and truth, both Christian and pagan. Classical Christian education taught the ultimate coherence and even unity of biblical, classical, and German to students as different as Thomas Jefferson and Joseph Pieper. Tolkien shared with Jefferson and Pieper an education that taught them to appreciate and love the classical and Christian canons and the German legacy. No one of these traditions cancels out the other. As different as they are, when heard rightly, there is not only coherence, but also harmony. The Christian happy ending does not obviate the profound tragic sense of the other traditions. In his Beowulf lecture and his letters and interviews, Tolkien talked about traits shared by Lord of the Rings, Virgil's Aeneid, and Beowulf. There is one theme not found in Beowulf, which is central to Lord of the Rings and also to the Aeneid, as interpreted by his fellow Inkling, C.S. Lewis, the theme of vocation. For all their differences, Frodo and Aragorn share a deep sense of vocation, which they express very much as Lewis describes vocation in his letters and scholarly writings on the Aeneid. During World War II, when he was composing Preface to Paradise Lost, he wrote to Dorothy Sayers, quote, "I've just reread the Aeneid again. The effect is one of the immense costliness of a vocation combined with a complete conviction that it is worth it. The whole story is littered with the costs: Creusa, Dido, Anchises, Palinurus, Pallas, Lausus, Camilla," end quote. Lewis discussed the centrality of vocation in the Aeneid in Preface to Paradise Lost, which in some respects is a greater book on the Aeneid than it is on Milton. He commented, quote, "It's the nature of a vocation to appear to men in the double character of a duty and a desire, and Virgil does justice to them both. On the one hand, we have Aeneas, who suffers but obeys. On the other hand, we have the Trojan women, who have heard the call and live long in painful obedience, and yet desert at last in Book 5. Virgil sees their tragedy very clearly. To follow the vocation does not mean happiness, but once it has been heard, there is no happiness for those who do not follow. The will remains suspended between two equal intolerables." Then he gives his translation of Aeneid 5, 655 following. "'Twixt miserable longing for the present land and the far realms that call them by the fates' command," end quotes. He goes on and writes, "It will be seen in these two lines, Virgil, with no intention of allegory, has described once and for all the very quality of most human life as it is experienced by anyone who has not yet risen to holiness or sunk to animality. It is not thanks to the fourth eclogue alone that Virgil has become almost a great Christian poet. In making his one legend symbolical of the destiny of Rome, he has willy-nilly symbolized the destiny of man," end quotes. Tolkien learned from his classical Christian education to love language and languages. He, in his own words, quotes, "first discovered the sensation of literary pleasure in Homer," end quotes. He found truth in myth and stories. From Virgil, he learned to evoke, again in his own words, quotes, "the constant presence of a sense of many-storied antiquity," quotes. But also he learned how the theme of vocation, as fulfilling and tragic, could provide the basis for a great, long work. At the end of the meeting at Rivendell, Frodo accepts his vocation. "I will take the ring," he said, "though I do not know the way." As Lewis wrote, to repeat, quotes, "To follow the vocation does not mean happiness, but once it has been heard, there is no happiness for those who do not follow," end quotes. Tolkien may also have been influenced by his own vocation. He wrote, H. Cotton Minchin, "I am primarily a philologist." Despite his brilliant lecture on Beowulf, Tolkien did not see himself as a literary critic. His valedictory address to the Oxford faculty is clear about his place in the language or philological side of the split Oxford English faculty, despite his insightful literary and critical essays. The literary critic is a perpetual optimist. When he sees a work attacked or misunderstood, he rushes to its defense, waves his magic pen, and voila, all is light. Like some doctors, he tends to ignore, marginalize, and even blame the fragmentary and broken works that he cannot restore to wholeness. The philologist lives in the tragic world of partially lost or broken beauty. He knows an 18th century fire ate away the page of the Beowulf manuscript that explains why the dragon attacks after ages at rest. He knows of Gothic, a language that survives only in one translation of the Gospels. As a schoolboy, Tolkien wrote Zillah sharing, quotes, "I was fascinated by Gothic in itself, a beautiful language which reached the eminence of liturgical use, but failed, owing to the tragic history of the Goths, to become one of the liturgical languages of the West," end quotes. The philologist does not despair, but his hope is realistic. That burned page is gone forever. And his attitude is tempered by gratitude for what survives. Loss makes what remains more precious. Hausmann, the classical philologist, devoted his professional life to rescuing what has survived of Latin poetry from scattered medieval manuscripts in the face of his age's false scientific method and falser romantic sensibility. His work still inspires that continuing rescue operation, which is at least as vital to the world of letters as his few score gloomy lyrics. Tolkien played the same role in his field of Germanic languages and myths. As a young man, he worked on the Oxford English Dictionary and learned that once upon a time, grammar and glamour were the same word. He devoted his life as pedant and poet to helping us feel that unity as a living reality. I've quoted Yeats before, I'll do it again. Man is in love, and love's what vanishes. What more is there to say? Well, both literary critic and philologist have much more to say, of course. While the literary critic uses his rational mind to create the best of all possible literary worlds, Beowulf fights the eerie dragon of destruction, the devourer of heroes, languages, manuscripts, and human memory. The philologist fights by his side. Tolkien wrote his son Christopher, quote, "You and I belong to the ever-defeated, never altogether subdued side," end quote. He stands next to the Old Norse gods, about whom Tolkien liked to quote the American philologist W.P. Kerr. He quotes him in his Beowulf essay. Kerr wrote about the Norse gods, quotes, "They're on the right side, though it is not the side that wins. The winning side is chaos and unreason. But the gods, who are defeated, think that defeat no refutation," end quotes. It all sounds pretty Germanic. Can it be relevant to Americans who are classical Christian educators? Well, let me give one possible line of argument. Let's bracket for the moment the best American movie and ask the question about the most purely American one. Just mentioned the best American movie is probably full of Italian, if you know what I'm referring to. But let's say the most purely American one. Then I would pick Frank Capra's 1939 film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Near the end, young Jefferson Smith, played by Jimmy Stewart, has pretty much reached the end of his tether, delivering single-handedly a filibuster on the floor of the U.S. Senate, so the people of his state can hear his side of a smear campaign. Joseph Payne, his state's corrupt senior senator, played by the great character actor Claude Rains, enters with bushels of letters and telegrams denouncing Smith, arranged by the political machine that runs his state. Jeff Smith rifles through the mail in growing despair, then slowly turns to his colleague and speaks. "Well, I guess this is just another lost cause, Mr. Payne." "Oh, you people don't know about the lost causes." Mr. Payne does. "He said once they were the only causes worth fighting for, and he fought for them once for the only reason that any man ever fights for them, because of just one plain, simple rule: love thy neighbor. And in this world today, full of hatred, a man who knows that one rule has a great trust. You know that rule, Mr. Payne, and I loved you for it just as my father did. And you know that you fight for the lost causes harder than for any others. Yes, you even die for them, like a man we both knew, Mr. Payne," end quotes. Senator Smith found no contradiction between biblical truth and a Germanic fighting for lost causes any more than Tolkien did. And it's not just a question of Beowulf's hopeless struggle with the dragon, or the death of the dwarf Balin, son of Fundin, in what is called his valiant but foolish attempt to retake Moria. A country whose famous battles include the Alamo and Custer's Last Stand used to know what Professor Tolkien and Senator Smith were talking about. And if we've forgotten, then maybe we need to read Beowulf, the Aeneid, and the Lord of the Rings one more time. And I thank you for your kind attention. If there are questions or comments or outrage, please. Yes, Dr. V.
Just a few weeks ago, Tolkien's translation of Beowulf came out. I haven't seen it. I'm curious if you've seen it and how good it is, and recommend that as a good text to read, good translation.
Yes, they decided to publish that in a time period in which, due to my schedule, it would only confuse me to have read it. So I decided to save that for the other side of this, and I could find out if it refutes what I said or not. It includes both his translation. There are a number of good ones that are out there, and I'm sure that it's interesting to see what he did with it. Also includes his lecture notes, so that would also be of interest. It's probably significant that he, published his great essay, but did not publish his lecture notes. Although he was a well-known, a very successful lecturer. We know that Auden fell in love with Old English because he attended Tolkien's lectures and heard him read passages in Old English. He fell in love with it. Despite what we're told in today's universities, that scholars don't teach well and teachers don't publish, both Tolkien and Lewis were fantastic lecturers. John Lennox, the Oxford mathematician who has done wonderful stuff doing in the scientific worldview, attended Lewis's last lectures. And he said they were like, Tolkien was the opposite. He walked in quietly, and then he would develop. Lewis was the opposite. He walked in speaking, delivered without notes an entire hour lecture, and then exited speaking the last line. It was absolutely sensational performance on that. It's sort of embarrassing for the publishing scholars who claim they can get away with being mediocre teachers when you hear these really great scholars, were both of them, superb teachers. So when I have time, I'm going to look at it and see. And I may have to then write you all a little email saying, ignore what I said, right? I hope not. Comments, questions, please.
So I have to comment, you certainly also give the lie to great scholars not being good lecturers. Thank you for the presentation, it was wonderful.
Thank you. I made me blush.
One of the quotes that you gave was someone who said that Anglo-Saxons don't do the death of dragons as well as, was it the Danes?
Yes, Danes and Icelandic people.
Yes. So my question is why? Why did the Anglo-Saxons treat that with so much more drama, build-up, context than the Norwegians or the Scandinavians?
Yes, the Icelandic. Yes, that's in Kleber's edition. It's famous because it's the only literary comment in the entire, and it's quite a decent-sized volume, and of course now they've redone it and it's even bigger, but not necessarily better. Yeah, what I think Tolkien felt is that the Beowulf poet is attempting to give a feeling for the enormous background, the melancholy, the heroism of an heroic life, which in the pre-Christian world must always end by losing. No matter how many Super Bowls you win, eventually there'll be one you do not win. No matter how many monsters you kill, he does a couple of quite impressive ones, there'll always be the final one. The wages of heroism is death. The Icelandic guys are much more efficient. It's prose for one thing. Very much on character responding to challenge, and there's no, I mean, as far as greatness and heroism and tragedy, you also get that, but it's very much the tragedy of a situation, and Jarl Saga being one of the great examples. So, I mean, I think that is what was felt by Tolkien, whose knowledge of the Norse side was fantastic. He also said he read Gothic as a not an undergraduate, but a high school student. Let's give you a headache thinking about how bright he was. I think that's part of the reason, that there's the character in his situation. And Tolkien admits in his letter to Michael, his son, of course, if you write a long story, you have to show people's emotions and responding to situations. But what touches him most is the idea that everything we do is part of a long tradition that stretches back a long way. And that's what you saw in Beowulf. And of course, then he attempted to use his knowledge of the Icelandic to give individual scenes power. And, Death of Boromir, that'd be a great Icelandic moment. Tempted, failing his vocation, then at the last moment fighting bravely to the death.
And do you see that dark past as, I don't know what the word would be, an allusion to, or an inference to the fall?
No, I see it as the idea that the world we have is not something that was invented from scratch recently. We're often told after some event, nothing matters after, choose your favorite date. And for Tolkien, what we have is rooted in a long, long past.
But a tragic past.
But it is a tragic past. It is a tragic past because we're still here. To live in history and to live to your vocation is going to be tragic. And it's interesting because he does believe in a happy ending. There's a sense that Sam returns to happiness. But Frodo is broken. I mean, he accepts his vocation. He does everything to go all the way. He can't quite. He's saved by a situation that, if you know the book, you know. I'm not going to spoil it if you don't. But in a way, there's no life for him anymore in the world he has saved.
Right.
The great parallel in American literature, by the way, End of the Searchers, they all go in the house to celebrate the return of the little girl, now a woman, of course. At the end, there's only John Wayne left. He walks away by himself. He's very much that kind of person who lived his vocation and did what he had to do. But in doing it, he lost all the other goods that lesser creatures enjoy.
Like Natty Bumppo.
Like Natty Bumppo also. Yes, that's right. There's a sense in which these great heroes who have saved us, if Sam gets to live life and have a family and on, not Frodo. That's not his. Not to mention the ones who died in the end as well. I mean, that's what really affected Tolkien with those feelings. He knew there had to be other emotions involved. There has to be love. There has to be, all the rest of it. But these were the things that really touched him the most. And these things go back and back and back. And it's part of our feeling that, in one sense, we Americans don't have a long perspective. We have 200 years. We're always worried about the founders turning in their graves. And Europeans don't seem to be interested in that anymore. Nobody's worried about George III turning his grave or whatever. But we are, all the time, right? We bring it up. But actually, our past goes much further back. That's one thing we have to offer as classical educators, is that it's not just 200 years. It's 2,000 years. It's 3,000 years. And there are losses there, too. Lot's wife, Saul and Jonathan, also fighting. And the Philistines seem to win more battles than they lose until David takes over. Comments, questions, outrage. No outrage? Catholics in the back of the room left. Yes, sorry.
Well, so I seem to remember in the Inklings that one of them, I think it was Dorothy Sayers, cursed at the thought of Tolkien telling another story about a fairy. What do you make of that?
Well, we know they love to listen to one another's stories. her great strength was, one, in realistic fiction, and two, in appreciating a great Christian poem, Dante's Divine Comedy. So she really was, in one sense, the un-Tolkien. Her most successful things are about Lord Peter being in advertising, all the rest of these things. Or else there's Dante's poem, which is permeated with Christianity, although it's also permeated by the classical as well. The thing that's probably interesting is what Tolkien probably thought of Lewis's fiction, where Lewis always has Christianity, at the surface. Now, one of the things we all discovered when they finally made the movie about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is that half of America had no idea that there was a Christian theme there. Still baffles me to this day that they couldn't. All these people being interviewed saying, "Oh, I always loved that as a child, and it's such a wonderful movie," which it is. Very successful movie there. And they never seem to mention the fact that the hero dies and comes back. Does that remind them of anything? No, not special. So Tolkien actually needn't have worried so much that Lewis had made it too explicit in his works, because once they became bestsellers in America, people all thought Lewis invented that stuff, right? Whereas for Tolkien, he got on his nerves that Lewis was, he grated on him that Lewis was so explicit in his Christian message. He worked very hard to make it not explicit. And then, of course, along come, the Catholic Renaissance people who won't let anybody be anything else but a full-time propagandist. Which would be amusing to hear what his comments would have been about all these people, putting back in the book what he carefully took out in his own. Very clearly, he says so. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your kind attention, and go forth and enjoy and reread The Lord of the Rings if you haven't done it recently.